Hello, and welcome yet again to our series of lectures on the foundations of Western civilization. This will be lecture number 28, and we'll address ourselves in this lecture to the Christian culture of late antiquity. This is then the fourth of our four lectures on the world of late antiquity. We began with Edward Gibbon's Immoderate Greatness, the political structures of the Roman world. We turned then to his barbarism, one of the external forces in the transformation of the Roman world. And his second external force was superstition. We explained last time that that's what he understood by Christianity. We talked last time about the Christian church, the emergence of the Roman church, the emergence of a basic kit of doctrines, and the emergence of a Catholic, a universal tradition. In this lecture, we're going to turn to three related, but nevertheless somewhat different subjects. We're going to talk first of all about the age of the Church Fathers, the first great age of Christian intellectual life, or we might put it this way, the period when Christianity moved from seeking intellectual respectability to becoming intellectually dominant. We'll then turn to a certain number of Christians who in an interesting sort of way opted out. If the church, the visible public institution in the world that we referred to last time, is one important story of late antiquity, then those who became monks and nuns, those who left the urban, formal, public, structured, institutional world of the Roman Empire are also important and will attract a bit of our attention. And finally, we'll conclude by asking a series of questions that I suppose could be boiled down to this one. So what? That is to say, what impact did Christianity have on the lives, the beliefs, the habits, the attitudes, the struggles of ordinary people? Now, this being the basic subjects to which we'll introduce ourselves in this lecture, to which we'll concern ourselves, let's turn then to the age of the Church Fathers. The intellectual culture and indeed the intellectual caliber of late antique Christianity is inextricably bound up with a group of thinkers whom we call the Church Fathers, who dominated cultural life in a period we call patristic, from the Latin patres. So the age of the patres is the patristic age. Now, some of you may be asking yourselves why there is no matristic age. Well, there were no church matres, and that's not my fault, and you'll have to take up that problem with others than with me. Now, we talked in an earlier lecture about the fact that already in the 2nd and early 3rd century, there had been Christian writers, the apologists, remember, who had attempted to address questions that were arising even then for the Christian community. How was Christianity different from paganism? How was Christianity different from Judaism? How could one live as a Christian in a pagan world? It's also interesting to note that in the late 2nd and into the 3rd century, Christian ideas were beginning to circulate sufficiently in the Mediterranean world that there were at least a few pagan writers, Porphyry, and a few others, who actually began to address themselves to Christian teachings by way of trying to refute them. Now, you don't refute something that you don't take seriously. So the point is that we have some hint, some faint suggestion that Christian ideas were already getting some purchase on the public mind in the 3rd century. Well, once Christianity became legal, as we saw in our last lecture, one of the things that happened was that some of the quarrels, some of the controversies, some of the difficulties, some of the complexities implicit in Christian teachings surfaced. They could now come to the surface. For a long time, of course, Christians had been illegal, and they weren't going to draw attention to themselves by battling out in public. Once those problems began to become public, a group of thinkers began addressing themselves to those problems and to much else besides, as we'll see as we go along. It is this period then which we label patristic. We can say, broadly speaking, that the patristic period runs from about 300 to 600 in the West, from about 300 to about 750 in the East. But the really great work, the creative, the dynamic period, runs from about 350 to 450. So primarily our focus here in the remarks in this lecture will rest on this period between about 350 and 450, but we'll sneak outside those boundaries a little bit. This is also, it should be said, the very time when Christian art and Christian architecture begin to emerge as well. In other words, we can see various manifestations of Christian culture, not merely the written culture of intellectuals addressing extremely complicated and abstruse problems. Church fathers, then, the key figures in the patristic age, they addressed themselves to three big questions. Many, many questions, but three big ones. How is the Bible to be understood? Remember last time we talked about building a canon of Scripture, getting the basic books down. These are the books we're going to work with. Well, once that set of problems had been solved, one then had to turn to the very interesting, the very complex, the very difficult, but the very important problem of saying, how do we understand this Bible? Here again we see great continuity with the Jewish tradition. What rabbis did was explain the Scriptures. Now what the church is going to do is explain the Scriptures. In the second place, how are fundamental Christian doctrines to be explained? We talked last time. The problem of the Trinity. God is three in one, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Jesus is true God and true man. How do we explain these things? How do we talk about these things? Not surprisingly, pagan philosophy did not have vocabulary or conceptual frameworks to talk about a single metaphysical being who was both God and man, for instance. So Christianity had to figure out what to do with questions like that. Third, what does classical culture have to do with Christianity? What does Christianity have to do with classical culture? Or, as one Christian writer said, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Christianity grew up in a world of old, powerful, deep cultural traditions. How was it going to position itself with respect to those traditions? So, without trying to claim here that they addressed every potential problem or that they solved every problem that they addressed, it is basically the church fathers who will help us to answer these three questions. The first of the great Latin fathers, and it's important to say that there were Greek fathers as well, and I'll come to some of them in a few minutes. The first of the great Latin fathers was Ambrose. Now, Ambrose lived from 339 until 397. He was a local nobleman who was then elected Bishop of Milan. Now, Milan was a very important city in late antiquity. Indeed, it was really the capital of the Western Empire for a long time. Emperors were much more commonly in Milan than they ever were in Rome. So we see this theme that I hinted at in the last lecture of powerful local people who had once served the Roman administration, now going into the service of the church. We'll see in Ambrose the kind of figure who once might, as an intellectual in the pagan tradition, have spoken to the Roman tradition. Now he is going to speak to the Christian tradition. Ambrose, a very interesting person. He wrote beautiful poems and beautiful hymns. Many of his poems, subsequently translated into English, set to music, are still used in Christian churches to this day. But the basic points we want to make in connection with Ambrose are these. First, he translated the Greek philosophical ideas and even some of the writings of Greek Christian writers such as Origen of Alexandria into intelligible form for Latins. Broadly speaking, we can say that Latin was somewhat poorer in philosophical vocabulary than Greek was, and we can say that Christianity was infinitely poorer in philosophical and/or theological vocabulary than the pagan traditions had been. So Ambrose was a first figure who opened up the world of Greek Christian thought to the Latin Christian world. That was a very important bridge that he built, and a very important contribution of his to the growing Christian culture of late antiquity. Second, with respect to Ambrose, he developed and he propagated the use of allegory in the Latin West as a mode of biblical interpretation. Now, this actually was something, again, which owed a great deal to Origen of Alexandria, whom I mentioned a moment ago. The problem basically is this. There were many passages in the Bible that seemed not to make full sense, that seemed contradictory to common sense or human reason. Many passages of the Bible seemed almost banal, or seemed almost obvious. How were these passages to be understood? Well, what Ambrose builds is a doctrine that many passages of Scripture are symbolic. They hide, they conceal layer upon layer upon layer of meaning. And according to one's ability with the method of allegory and according to one's learning, one can extract more and more meaning. In other words, what is there immediately on the surface is not to be ignored, but is never going to exhaust the meaning of a passage of Scripture. So, the introduction really into the West of allegory, crucial contribution of Ambrose. The second great Latin father is Jerome. Born in 342, he dies in 420. We met him last time as the translator of the Vulgate Bible, the Latin translation authorized by Pope Damasus. That, of course, is his greatest contribution. But we might just mention that here we have another Roman blue blood who is attracted to the service of the church. Jerome, in fact, becomes not a bishop, but a monk. He wrote numerous letters. His letters survive. His letters were in later times much admired. And in these letters, he explained a lot of very complicated Christian problems that were existing in his time. And Jerome is particularly interesting to us as well because he created a kind of, in Rome at least, a kind of a salon society where noble, high-born Roman women came and received instruction from him. Now, it's interesting, too, that Jerome was one of the most highly prized of all Roman writers later in the Renaissance, and he was prized precisely for the elegance, the almost incomparable elegance of his Latin. So we do want to bear in mind that these Christian writers did not leave the cultural attainments of classical civilization behind them. The greatest of the Latin fathers, and indeed, perhaps after St. Paul, the second most influential, or after Paul, the most influential, with Paul, one of the two most influential writers in the entire history of Christianity, was Aurelius Augustinus, St. Augustine. Born in North Africa in 354, died there in 430. He was born to a middling sort of family. His mother, Monica, was a devout Christian. His father was not. The family didn't really have the means to provide him an education. Other relatives stepped into the breach and provided him with the funds that he needed. Here's an interesting example of somebody who was able to rise pretty high through talent in the late Roman world. Now, this wasn't an opportunity everyone would have had, and certainly not everyone would have had the talent that Augustine did, but here is someone who does not start with, as it were, a silver spoon in his mouth, and therefore many advantages in life. Well, he studied in the local schools and became a teacher of rhetoric. He eventually moved on to Rome, which he saw, not surprisingly, as sort of greener pastures, and then on to Milan, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, was a very important city, indeed often the imperial capital in late antiquity. Now, in Milan, he fell under the influence of Ambrose. Augustine had had a kind of a conventional, despite his mother's deep faith, he had a kind of a conventional pagan education. He didn't have much interest in Christianity. He thought, for example, that Paul's epistles were appallingly written, which, truth to tell, in some ways they are, at least as models of style. He thought that the Old Testament was full of old wives' tales, and no serious person could possibly take any of that sort of thing seriously. He went to Milan, and he'd heard a great deal about Ambrose, about this preacher Ambrose. Now, Augustine's a professor of rhetoric, so obviously the ability to speak well in public would be something that interested him a great deal. So he went to hear Ambrose. He said, "I went to mock," and came away converted. Ambrose gradually, well, I suppose we should say, I was going to say he gradually won him over. I think Ambrose began the process by which Augustine was won over. Augustine was a prolific writer. One late antique writer said, if anyone tells you he's read all of St. Augustine's books, you know he is a liar. He was not a systematic thinker. That is to say, he never sat down and said, I'm going to explain Christianity sort of from the beginning to the end, the whole deal. He responded to crises, he responded to problems, he responded to questions. Now, he lived in a time that threw up plenty of problems and crises and questions. But the point is, he was not a systematic thinker. He addressed himself to individual problems as these problems presented themselves to him. He wrote a great deal, as I mentioned a moment ago. Let's be a bit reckless even, and just mention 3 of his books, and then just mention a little bit about each of these 3 books, any one of which could easily be the subject for a course of lectures almost as long as the one we're embarked on now. Augustine's Confessions chronicled his own conversion. They stand as maybe the first true work of introspection in European literature. They are much more personal than Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, which I mentioned on an earlier day. He Here Augustine bears his soul, bears his quest for God in a quite remarkable way, and in a language that is elegant, polished, refined, beautiful, moving. His book on Christian doctrine was the first systematic exposition of how Christianity related to classical learning. He basically took the position that in order to read the great Christian text, you're going to have to learn your Latin, perhaps your Greek as well. Augustine actually didn't have very good Greek. But you're going to have to learn your Latin. You're going to have to learn all the tricks of the rhetorical arts. You better know some history. You better know lots of other things as well. But then Augustine said, what we will do is spoil the Egyptians. We'll learn all of these things, this metaphor being taken from the Hebrews leaving Egypt before the Exodus. They would take with them only what they could use for the journey. So you would pass through pagan antiquity and take only what you need, as it were, for the Christian journey. But nonetheless, you would take it. You wouldn't leave it beside. You would take with you at least what you could use. His City of God was a magnificent theology of history. Now, it was occasioned by the Gothic sack of Rome in 410, which was something that had been profoundly distressing to large numbers of people. But Augustine does something rather interesting here. He says, you know, in the grand scheme of things, Rome doesn't matter very much. Now remember again those lines from Virgil. I place for them no end in space or time. They will rule forever. Nothing was more deeply embedded in the Roman psyche that the world would last as long as Rome lasted. Now Augustine says, well, you know, now Rome really just isn't all that important. We just don't really need to worry about Rome all that much, because all of human history, from the creation of humankind until the Last Judgment, is marching to a final salvation of the world, a final regeneration of the human race. He used the images of the city of God and the city of man. The city of man, the world of sinners, the world of ordinary people. The city of God, the world of the redeemed. Gradually, the world of the redeemed would absolve all sinners. You'll notice here that history is now linear. We have again and again and again stressed the ancient view that history is cyclical, that it repeats itself. For Augustine, history marches in a direction to ultimate redemption. The last of the Latin fathers was Pope Gregory I. Now, Gregory I, we met him, remember, running the city of Rome after the absence of a Roman government. Gregory wrote biblical commentaries. He wrote letters. He wrote lives of saints. And he wrote a remarkable book called The Pastoral Rule, which was not unlike Cicero's book on duties, a manual of how to be a bishop. What kind of a person you ought to be a bishop, and what you ought to do if you're a bishop. This book was profoundly influential for a very long time. Now, in the Eastern Mediterranean, there were fathers, too. We'll speak of them a bit more briefly, but not to disdain them, rather only to signal that we have a much larger and more complex phenomenon here to talk about, were we able to do so. The so-called Cappadocian fathers, Basil the Great, 330 to 379, his brother, Gregory of Nyssa, 330 again to 395, and Gregory Nazianzus, 329 to 389. Were formidable biblical scholars, were formidable spiritual writers, but they are perhaps most important to us because they laid down many of the fundamental definitions in the great Trinitarian and Christological battles, God is three in one, God is man and God, that we talked about a little bit in this lecture and also in the preceding one. Their slightly younger contemporary, John Chrysostom, John Golden-throated, 347 to 407, was Patriarch of Constantinople. He was a preacher of enormous skill and power. Here was a man, again, who knew his rhetorical arts. Here was a person who wrote at great length on how the Christian may live the moral life while still functioning in the world. But here also was a man brave enough to take on the imperial court. He criticized them bitterly for their immorality and for setting a bad example. He earned himself a couple of periods of exile as a result of this. But the point is that he was taking the position that no one should be exempt from criticism, not even the imperial court. So these are some of the kinds of issues to which the church fathers addressed themselves, and some of the church fathers themselves. What about those who opted out? In an era of great intellectual achievement, a time when the church was gaining power and status, there were those who turned their back on intellectual achievement, on power, on status, on wealth, on importance. These were the monks. Now, there had always been asceticism practice, exercise, generally speaking, the notion of some kind of self-denial. There had always been an ascetic tradition in Judaism. There was an ascetic tradition in early Christianity. There have been ascetic traditions in most religious traditions around the world. We're interested here in the ascetic tradition as it embedded itself in Christianity. There are always those, in other words, who believe that rigorous self-denial and discipline might make it possible to gain something like union with God. If I deny myself food, if I deny myself companionship of other people, if I deny myself sex, if I deny myself power, I may be able to purify myself. You see? Now, sometimes these people lived as solitaries, sometimes they lived as communities. Christian monasticism, as a blending of these various traditions, emerged in Egypt in the 4th century. It rises in the first instance with a man by the name of Anthony. Now, Anthony was a solitary who established the eremitic ideal in Christian monasticism. This comes from the Greek word eremos, which means desert. So eremitic monks are basically solitaries. They are persons who live as far as possible all alone. Anthony's successor, Pachomius, who lived from 290 to about 346, began as a solitary. He kept having people come out to kind of learn from him, to study from him, and finally he decides, all right, look, we got to get these guys organized. And he creates the first formal communities for men, and then a bit later, but not much later, for women, living what we call the cenobitic life. Now this comes from 2 Greek words, koinos bios, meaning common life. So we can have eremitic monks living essentially as hermits, or we can have cenobitic monks leading a common life together. Monks are therefore monachoi, lone ones, who live in a monasterion, a house of lone ones. There's a wonderful paradox there, isn't it? A monastery is a community of large numbers of people living alone together. Now, especially after Pachomius, the persons who are cenobitic follow a rule, a regula. And so they come to be called eventually in the Catholic tradition regular clergy because they follow a regula. Now, from Egypt, monasticism spread, and it spread for a number of reasons. A Life of St. Anthony was written, for example. It was written in Greek, very quickly translated into Latin. It was widely circulated, widely disseminated, and was a real sort of late antique bestseller that helped to propagate this life. Collections of the wise sayings of the so-called Desert Fathers began to circulate. These also were widely influential. St. Jerome took a particular fancy to the monastic life, and indeed eventually in Bethlehem formed a monastic community himself. He popularized monasticism, and as I suggested a moment ago, through his letters he was in contact with large numbers of people. People who traveled to Egypt sat at the feet of the great religious masters and then went back whence they had come and taught what they themselves had learned. So one way or another, this Egyptian phenomenon began to be universalized in the late antique world. Eremitic monasticism spread particularly in the eastern Mediterranean through the work of St. Basil, whose rule for monks was normative for centuries in the Eastern Catholic Church, or eventually, as we will call it in later lectures, in the Orthodox Church. Eremitic monasticism sort of got a foothold in the West in the first place, in Gaul, through the work of St. Martin at Tours. Martin lives from 336 to 397. And then St. Honoratus, who lived at Lerins in the south of France from 350 to about 429. And it spread also in Ireland through the work of St. Patrick, whom we may date between about 390 and 462, although fixing Patrick's dates is pretty tricky business. But in the West, the future really belonged to cenobitic monasticism, and thus to the heritage of Benedict of Nursia. Benedict, born about 480, dies in about 550. He came from a modest Roman family. Then he abandoned secular studies to pursue a life of Christian retreat. Eventually, he gathered a community around himself at Monte Cassino, about 80 miles south of Rome. And there, in about 540, he wrote what has become the most famous and the widely adopted rule in all of monastic history. Now, it's important to say, Benedict composed this rule for his own monastery. Gregory I admired it and popularized it with his biography of Benedict. And therefore it began to spread and spread and spread and spread. We'll encounter it in later lectures. It was particularly prized in early England, and English missionaries promoted it on the continent. Anglo-Saxons influenced the Franks, whose greatest king, Charlemagne, imposed the Benedictine rule on monasteries all over Europe. So gradually, the humble effects of Benedict in central Italy were quite accidentally, and quite without his having intended this to be the case, spread throughout much of Western Europe and then even to the world beyond. So we have church fathers who deal with great intellectual issues. We have monks who in some way opt out. Let's conclude with some reflections on the final question I posed at the beginning of the lecture. So what? How did Christianity affect culture and life? Well, we might notice, for example, the Christians continued to use Greek and Latin, thus assuring their preservation, and enriching them with new vocabulary, with new conceptual frameworks, with new things to talk about. Christians added much to the vocabulary of both Greek and Latin. Now, what should I think signal and then not press too hard the old thesis of the very famous German scholar Adolf von Harnack, that classical culture captured Christianity? Remember Horace's great remark about Greece, that captive Greece took her captor captive? In a certain way, von Harnack saw classical culture having done that to Christianity. The fact of the matter is, and I've signaled this in connection with Augustine's book on Christian doctrine, that the Christians knew how to spoil the Egyptians. Yes, they took much from the classical world around them, but I think they did not succumb to it, and I think they did not compromise with it over much. Let's emphasize, for example, a slightly different kind of issue, Christian patronage. Remember I signaled the end of the great Roman building boom during the 3rd century, during the period of crisis? When we come to the 4th century, remember I signaled that Constantine gave the money to build St. Peter's in Rome, to build St. Paul's in Rome, that he donated the land on which the Lateran Basilica eventually rose with, again, his support. This began to happen all over the Roman world. Christian patronage put an end to the building bust of the 3rd century, and over the 4th and on into the 5th, the most splendid edifices built around the Christian world in city after city after city after city were their cathedral churches. Now gradually these churches and other public spaces, and sometimes even domestic spaces in homes that might once have been decorated with sort of floral scenes, or might have been decorated with pictures of classical motifs, stories from the Iliad, stories from the Aeneid, wherever the stories might have come from, now began to be depicted with scenes from the scriptures, with traditional scenes or sometimes even legendary scenes. In other words, a Christian art began to emerge. Yes, it used certain classical artistic motifs. Yes, it continued to use mosaic, setting tiles in wet plaster. Yes, it continued to use fresco, painting on wet plaster so that the painting became part of the wall. Yes, some of the figures look much like the figures in classical pictures, but the fundamental themes were different. And gradually a Christian art that was something old at once, old and new, began to arrive. Christian poets carried on the classical tradition. Indeed, in the 4th and the 5th and the 6th and the 7th and the 8th and in the 20th century, Christian poets have written poetry that can stand comparison to the best that was written in the ancient world. I signaled this a few minutes ago in connection with St. Ambrose. Christianity did other things too. It took the very curious step of assigning enormous power to celibate men. But it did this at the same time in a world where it said all were equal because all were sinners. So in a democracy of sin, celibate men were accorded great power. Here is a fascinating paradox, something old and something new. Christian martyrs and saints created new kinds of hero figures. Martyrs, of course, famous for how they died. After Christianity was granted toleration, saints famous for how they lived. But here were new heroes, not the heroes of the Iliad, not the heroes of the Aeneid, but new and different kinds of heroes. A new morality assured women a more secure place in society. The morality that applied to men was applied to them as well. Slowly but surely, Christian ethics pervaded secular law. We'll see some examples of this in later lectures in more concrete terms, but suffice it to say that secular law began to be marked by Christianity. So the lands that had been the western provinces of the Roman Empire had evolved into a series of kingdoms, often enough as a result of Roman policies. A church that was barely visible in 180 at the end of the Pax Romana has become regnant, triumphant in the Roman world. A culture that had produced a small number of writings about which there were deep controversies at the end of the Pax Romana has become the dominant culture of the Roman world. These are the paradoxes of continuity and change in the world of late antiquity.